From thrift stores to trash dumpsters, 2025 was full of incredible finds and epic makeovers. And today we're celebrating the best of the best. Join me as we count down the top 20 transformations of the year, starting right now.
Oddly enough, for this first project, I actually saved my dryer lint for a few weeks because I wanted to see if I could turn it into paper. I blended the lint with some water, but then I realized I needed a bonding agent. So I added a glob of white glue mixed with water and blended it again. I used a splatter screen to drain off the excess water, and as I pressed out the water, I pushed the lint, trying to make it as thin as possible while still keeping it in one piece. Then I placed it on a towel and went over it with a rolling pin to flatten it out even more. I let it dry overnight, and the next day I attached it to the back of a Dollar Tree frame using spray adhesive. I trimmed the excess around the edges and sealed it with a thick coat of Mod Podge. And no, I wasn't just planning to frame a piece of lint. I added a small rub-on transfer, which worked perfectly since the surface was sealed. I didn't love how the Dollar Tree frame looked with the lint, so I swapped it out for a thrifted frame instead. I left the lint attached to the backing of the Dollar Tree frame, though, and just cut it down to fit inside the thrifted frame. I also removed the glass so the texture of the lint would really show through. And since the frame had a few small dings, I went over it with some black wax to help disguise them. For this next project, I spent $1.99 on this metal stand, but I have no idea what it is. So if you recognize it, please leave me a comment. I didn't mind the original gold finish, but for the idea I had in mind, I thought it would look better painted white. Then I lightly distressed it with sandpaper and sealed it with a coat of clear wax. To attach a bird nest to the top, I secured it with a combination of hot glue and florist wire, threading the wire through the holes in the metal piece at the top, then through the nest, twisting the ends tightly together. After that, I hot glued a thrifted ceramic bird into the nest. My idea for this odd little stand was to turn it into a twine dispenser. So I grabbed a skein of cotton twine and transferred it onto the center rod. I used my lazy Susan to spin it and wrap the twine really quickly. Before calling it finished, I embellished the nest with a bit of greenery, some tiny eggs, and Spanish moss. And for the final touches, I tucked the end of the twine into the bird's beak and added a small pair of scissors to the nest. This vertical sign started out as just a large painted piece of wood. I first sprayed it with Zinsser primer to cover up the original typography and then painted it with ivory chalk paint. While the paint was still wet, I spritzed 2 IOD paint inlay sheets and laid them onto the surface to create a vintage wallpaper look. I completely forgot to trim off the white edges, so I overlapped the sheets and hoped it would look like one continuous pattern. I rolled over everything with a brayer to press the inlays into the paint and then let it dry completely. Once it was dry, I spritzed the sheets again and carefully peeled them off, and they turned out great. Well, almost. As you probably guessed, I ended up with a visible seam where the two sheets overlapped. So I decided to add a small shelf to hide the seam and hang a Dollar Tree mirror above it. I sprayed the mirror frame with Zinsser primer, and then to make everything look cohesive, I painted both the shelf and the frame with white chalk paint. Once the paint was dry, I put the mirror back in the frame and used Gorilla Glue to attach it to the board, adding a few clips to hold it in place while the glue dried. I attached the shelf with wood glue, positioning it right over the seam. And once that was dry, I flipped the sign over and secured it with nails from the back. I didn't nail into the mirror frame though, because Dollar Tree frames are pretty flimsy and it would have split for sure. To finish everything off, I brushed on a coat of clear wax to seal the chalk paint on both the mirror frame and the shelf. For this project, I chose 5 books in colors that coordinated with this painting of a young girl reading. I removed the background using the Canva app and printed the image onto cardstock, sizing it to fit the combined width of all 5 books. Before attaching the picture, I wanted to remove the titles from the book spines. I found that Goof Off works really well for this, although this time it did remove a little of the book color too, which I actually didn't mind because it just made the books look more aged. I wrapped a rubber band around the books to hold them tightly together. Then I applied a generous amount of Mod Podge to the book spines and to the back of the paper. I lined the image up with the bottom edge of the spines, pressed it into place, and then rolled over it with a brayer to make sure everything adhered well. Once the Mod Podge was fully dry, I lined up a metal ruler with the edge of the book spines and used a sharp utility knife to trim the paper. When I pulled the books apart, there was about 1/8 of an inch of paper extending past each side. You could trim it off, but I decided to glue those edges down, gently working the paper with my fingers so that it conformed to the curve of each book spine. I thrifted this jewelry box for just $3.99. I couldn't pass it up because I love giving old boxes like this a new life with a little paint. So the first thing I did was to remove the tiny hardware. Then I gave the wood a good cleaning with liquid sandpaper. Next, I brushed on 2 coats of moss green chalk paint. I really enjoy painting smaller decor pieces like this. Using a small brush makes it easy to get into those tight details. Once the paint was dry, I started cutting up an old calendar illustration into smaller pieces to fit the front of each drawer. I brushed Mod Podge onto the drawer fronts and onto the back of the paper, and then pressed everything into place. I smoothed it out using my fingers and a brayer. I also used my fingers to create creases in the paper along the edges. After the Mod Podge was completely dry, I came back with a small piece of sandpaper along those crease lines to remove the excess paper. Because of the wood detailing on the drawers, it was pretty much impossible to avoid distressing the surrounding paint. I could have repainted those spots, but instead I decided to embrace it and lightly distress the edges of the entire box. Next, I brushed a coat of Mod Podge over the paper to seal and protect it. Once that was dry, I reattached the knobs and handles. To finish it off, I applied a coat of clear wax to seal and protect the chalk paint. Today's video is sponsored by Green Chef, and I am so excited to share this with you because it has truly simplified my life lately. December gets busy between the holidays, family coming, gift shopping, decorating, and everything else. We're all stretched thin. And honestly, the last thing I have time for is planning healthy meals. Green Chef is the #1 meal kit for clean eating, and they make eating well effortless, even during this busy time of year. Their meals use farmers market quality produce, and they have incredible globally inspired flavors. And everything comes pre prepped, so I don't have to stress about grocery shopping or figuring out what's for dinner. Green Chef has over 80 weekly menu options across a wide variety of dietary preferences, like plant based, gluten free, Mediterranean, and so much more. It's so easy to choose exactly what works for you.
So if you'd like to try Green Chef and give yourself a break from meal planning, just scan the QR code on the screen or use the link in my description box and the code Canterbury Graza to get 50% off your first order and a free Graza olive oil set with your second and third boxes.
Now, let's grab an empty tin can and give it a couple coats of ivory or white chalk paint. Then print out a vintage label on regular copy paper sized to fit your can. Pictures of old can labels are not going to be perfectly rectangular due to the can's curved surface. So print it out slightly larger than you need. Then you can trim it to fit. I brushed Mod Podge on the back of the paper, pressed it onto the can, and then sealed it with a top coat of Mod Podge. Next, I filled the can with repurposed packing styrofoam. To make a faux plant to put in the can, I mixed some green chalk paint and water at about a 4-to-1 ratio and dyed a stack of coffee filters. Once they were fully green, I pulled them apart and let them dry. And yes, you probably guessed I'm making a head of lettuce. I wrapped one filter around a small styrofoam ball and glued it in place. Then loosely layered the rest with just a drop of hot glue underneath. Once it was a good size, I added plenty of hot glue to the styrofoam and pushed the coffee filters into the can. I wanted to add a little rabbit in the center, so I glued a ceramic lid from my stash onto the styrofoam ball. You can really shape the filters to look like lettuce leaves and then finish it off with a ribbon around the top of the can. This gilded book looks like someone's DIY, but it was actually mass produced in the 1960s. While I love the 23rd Psalm, I decided to decoupage over the pages with botanical prints to cover up the damaged areas. I printed the images large enough to fully cover each page. And because the surface was uneven, I chose not to use Mod Podge and used a good quality glue stick instead. Elmer's Craft Bond works great and won't cause bubbling. I also didn't apply a top coat for fear of bubbling. I lightly sanded the edges to give the paper a naturally aged look. And then to turn the book into wall decor, I grabbed a frame from my stash that was slightly larger than the book. I removed the glass and backing, then covered the cardboard with green velvet cut from a thrift store pillow sham, and I hot glued the edges to the back. I glued the book in the center, but since it's so heavy, I also stapled through the cardboard into the spine and edges for extra security. Once it was back in the frame, I finished the back with brown craft paper and added a sawtooth hanger. Although I think this is a pretty lamp, orange doesn't really go with anything in my house. So I decided to give it a makeover. To paint it, I could have taped everything off. But if you've watched my channel much, then you know how easy it is to take a lamp apart. So I did that instead. I took the base and the body outside, cleaned them with liquid sandpaper, and then gave them 2 light coats of Zinsser Bullseye Primer, which, in my opinion, is the best spray primer out there. Since the base is plastic, I spray painted it black to make it look more like metal. My goal was to make this lamp look like Wedgwood blue Jasperware. So I painted the body of the lamp with 3 light coats of a soft blue chalk paint. To create the white applique design, I used an IOD cherry blossom mold with air dry clay. Start by dusting the mold with a little cornstarch so the clay doesn't stick. Then press the clay in and use your fingers to clean up the edges. I find it's easier to work in small batches. Don't let the pieces dry in the mold. You want them flexible so they can conform to the shape of the lamp. Attach the appliques right away using E6000 or Gorilla Glue, adding a generous amount to the back of each piece. If some of the pieces break, you can easily join them back together on the lamp. Once you're happy with your design, let the clay dry for at least 48 hours. Although the adhesive dried clear, I could see where it had seeped out from under the appliques, so I carefully painted over the dried glue with the blue chalk paint. Once everything was fully dry, I reassembled the lamp. To seal the lamp, use a clear acrylic spray like Rust-Oleum's Ultra Cover. It dries to a durable, non-yellowing finish and stays flexible enough to handle the slight expansion and contraction of the clay. In a similar project, I updated a vintage kitchen trivet by painting over the original design on the ceramic tile. Then I applied a clay applique in a strawberry design. This time I brushed antiquing wax over the clay and dabbed away most of it, leaving just enough to highlight the berry design. I thrifted this wooden bowl for under $3, but it was pretty scratched up. So I started by sanding the outside down to the bare wood. Using an orbital sander, it only took a few minutes. And then I sealed it with some feed-in wax to keep that natural look. I could have sanded the inside too, but I had a different plan. Instead, I painted the inside with ivory chalk paint and then used an IOD paint inlay that I had left over from another project. I spritzed the inlay with water and pressed it into the wet paint. But because of the curve of the bowl, a few wrinkles are unavoidable. I used a dry paintbrush to pounce it in and get the best possible adhesion. After a couple of hours, once everything was completely dry, I sprayed it again with water and carefully peeled off the paper. I was really pleased with the design, although as expected, there were some wrinkles. So I dried the paint with a heat gun and then lightly sanded over those areas with 220 grit sandpaper, just enough to soften the lines so it looks naturally worn. To seal it, I applied a coat of clear wax and then I dried that with my heat gun too. I did that so that when I next applied antiquing wax, it would be really easy to wipe away the excess. I really liked how the black and white scene looked with the rustic wood. This hurricane lamp was missing the top globe, so I wanted to see if I could use it in a different way. I began taking it apart and I realized there was a little candelabra bulb inside the glass globe, and that gave me an idea. I thought it would be fun to remove the main socket and just use the bottom globe as a little nightlight. Unfortunately, the candelabra bulb was wired into the main socket and didn't have its own plug. So I grabbed a light from a Christmas Village house and used that instead. I didn't care for the flower design on the glass and wanted to remove it and add something different. Normally, a little goof off and a razor blade will take care of painted designs like this, but this time it didn't work. So I tried a citrus paint stripper, let it sit for an hour, and then scrubbed it with steel wool. Most of the design did come off, but it didn't look great. So I decided to just paint the globe instead. I gave it a couple of coats of Rust-Oleum cinnamon spray paint. Once the paint was dry, I reassembled the bottom of the lamp. I found some metal leaves in my stash that came off an old Dollar Tree pumpkin and wrapped one of the wires under the top nut before tightening it back up. Then I pulled the plastic stem out of a styrofoam Dollar Tree pumpkin and trimmed down the prong with a utility knife so that it would fit inside the lamp pipe. I love these big picture frames with words on them because they have so many upcycling possibilities. I thrifted this one for just $4. To transform it, I decided to cover it with an old Lady of Shalott poster that I've probably had for 15 years. I cut the poster just slightly larger than the frame and sprayed the back really well with spray adhesive. Since you usually only get one shot with spray adhesive, I made sure everything was lined up before pressing it into place. Then I went over it with a brayer to make sure it was fully adhered. I trimmed off the excess using a utility knife along the outer edges and inside the picture opening, and then smoothed the edges with a little sandpaper. I could have sealed the poster with a clear acrylic spray, but for a more vintage look, I brushed dark wax over the poster and also along the sides and back of the frame. I thought it would be fun to add a feather and an old copy of a poem in the opening. So I grabbed one of the books that I keep around just for crafting. And I still can't believe this, but I opened it right to The Lady of Shalott by Tennyson. I honestly had no idea this book even included that poem. So I think it was just meant to be. Since the paper was pretty thin, I backed it with a piece of cardboard cut from an old cereal box and glued the poem down with a glue stick. Then I layered the feather on top for a little texture and popped it into the frame and put the backing back on. I actually found this trunk sitting on the curb in front of a neighbor's house. The wood really isn't nice enough to stain, but I knew a fresh coat of paint could completely change it. I started by wiping everything down with liquid sandpaper to clean it really well and prep it for paint. Then I painted the entire exterior with an olive green paint I had left over from another project. I couldn't remove the handles without damaging the fabric lining, so I just used a small artist brush to carefully paint around the hardware. I placed a plastic garbage can inside the trunk to prop the lid open so that I could paint the lid while the inside edges dried. Once the paint was dry, I decided to use a William Morris pattern peel and stick wallpaper from Amazon on the inset panels on the top and front of the trunk. Even though it probably wasn't necessary, I went ahead and sprayed those areas with easy hang spray so that I would be able to shift the paper around and get it perfectly aligned, or even remove it completely without damaging anything. Once the wallpaper was in place, I smoothed it out with a plastic scraper, and then I used that same scraper as a guide to trim the excess off with a utility knife. Then I wiped everything down with a damp cloth to remove any leftover spray. To add some color variation, I found an old can of Sherwin-Williams Urbane Bronze paint and used that to create a border around the wallpaper. For an extra detail, I cut out a bird and flower motif from the wallpaper and added one to each side of the trunk. As a finishing touch, I brushed on some very watered down antiquing wax, just enough to soften everything and give it a subtle, time worn look. This little metal bee was meant to be wall decor, but I had a different idea. The yellow paint on the body was pretty sloppy, so I gave it a quick coat of gold spray paint, and honestly, that made a huge difference. Then I created a hanger with a loop of gold string and attached a gold tassel that I had in my crafting supplies. A super simple project, but I think it makes a strong statement. I thrifted 3 coordinating trunks for less than $9 total. To transform them, I decided to paint them black. For full coverage, I gave each trunk 2 coats of black chalk paint. The surface of the trunks was pretty rough, so to smooth everything out, I sealed the paint with Mod Podge. I used Mod Podge instead of wax because I plan to add some rub-on transfers, and they don't adhere to wax surfaces. I chose a transfer sheet from IOD's Lost Garden collection and cut it in half, one piece for the medium trunk and one for the large trunk. Then I placed the half sheet on the front of the trunk and cut it into 2 pieces, one for the bottom and one for the lid. I took my time and I was so pleased that it adhered perfectly. The larger trunk needed a few extra pieces to fully cover the front, so I cut some smaller sections from a second sheet to fill in the gaps. In the end, I decided to style just the 2 larger trunks in my foyer. I normally wouldn't buy a contemporary lamp like this one, but it was only $4, and I had an idea for transforming it into something cute and cottagey. To begin, I pulled away the felt bottom so that I could remove the two nuts that were holding the base to the rest of the lamp. This allowed better access to the body of the lamp so that I could more easily wrap it with strands of raffia. I just hot glued one end of raffia to the metal rectangle and began wrapping it around the metal, making sure each new loop slightly overlapped the previous one to completely conceal the metal. When I reached the end of a piece of raffia, I hot glued it to the metal and started with a new strand of raffia wrapping over the previous piece. Once the metal was completely covered, I pushed the rectangle back into the base and reattached and tightened the nuts on the bottom. Then I used a little spray adhesive to reattach the felt bottom. I think the lamp already looks better, but I'm not done. I'm going to add two ceramic butterfly pot perchers that I bought on sale at Hobby Lobby. The orange paint on the butterflies was a little brighter than I prefer, so I brushed antiquing wax on them and lightly dabbed off the excess to give them a more subdued appearance. To attach them to the lamp, I used hot glue on the back of the butterflies' bodies and then used their wire arms to grip onto the raffia. The lampshade that came with this lamp was black and pretty scratched up, so I gave it a light, even coat of ultra matte black spray paint to freshen it up. I let the paint cure overnight, and the next day I cut out some Botanical IOD rub-on transfers to adhere to the shade. Luckily, they adhered easily and perfectly to the shade without damaging the paint at all. To finish off the lampshade and help it to better coordinate with the rustic raffia, I hot glued Dollar Tree burlap trim along the top and bottom edges of the shade. When I spotted this vintage bed footboard at the thrift store, I immediately thought it would make a great fire screen for our gas fireplace during the months when we're not actually using it. It does a great job of hiding the not so pretty firebox. It was already in really good condition, so all I did was polish it up with some feed and wax and remove the wheels from the legs so that it would sit more securely on the brick hearth. At first, I thought this lamp was wood, but once I looked at it a little closer, I realized that it was probably just resin or something similar. And since I don't need any more lamps, I decided to use it as a sculptural piece instead. I don't know if your Goodwill is this way, but if this had just been decor, they would have charged me twice as much as what I paid for it as a lamp. Removing the electrical parts is actually really easy, and I always save them for later in case I want to turn something else into a lamp. Once everything was out, the metal lamp pipe stuck up about 2 inches. I could have cut it off, but instead I used it to help hold a ceramic bird in place. You could still see a little bit of the pipe under the bird, so I wrapped some greenery stems around it to disguise it. I also noticed a few scratches where the white resin or plaster was showing through. So I brushed a little black rub and buff over those spots and it worked perfectly. I had an unusual idea for repurposing this angel figurine, but when I tried to shorten her skirt and she broke apart at the waist, I suddenly had to change my plan. To attach her to a base, I tried drilling a small hole in the torso to insert a small dowel rod, but it turned into a large hole. So I used the largest dowel rod I had and filled in around it with plenty of hot glue. For the lower body, I grabbed a thrifted terracotta pot. It was already filled with styrofoam because it had previously held faux flowers. I drilled a hole in the bottom of the pot that was about the size of the dowel rod. Then I pushed the dowel rod through the hole and into the styrofoam. I wanted the angel to appear as if she was made from the earth, so she needed to be darker. To accomplish this, I covered her with water-based antiquing wax and let it completely dry before dabbing away any excess. I did this a couple of times until I achieved a look I liked. I also filled in her arm joints with a little moss. To embellish the terracotta pot, I pulled out an IOD rub-on transfer that I had left over from last Christmas of two rabbits curled up. It adhered to the pot very easily. I didn't care for the pale orange color of the pot, so I brushed dark wax over both the pot and the transfer to give them a more aged appearance. I also lightly sanded over the transfer just so it didn't look so new. To go along with the nature theme, I decided to cover the angel's torso with pieces of fluffy reindeer moss. I had recently thrifted a small Christmas swag and began pulling the berries and greenery stems from that to embellish the terracotta pot, just gluing the ends under the moss. Then I realized I should probably reattach the wings before I added too much greenery. Although I loved the gauzy wings, I didn't care for the bright gold color, so I brushed on a water-based antiquing wax. That toned them down, but then they ended up looking a little too brown. So I lightly sprayed them with adhesive and sprinkled on just a touch of gold glitter, and I really ended up loving that effect. The wings are very lightweight, so I just used hot glue to reattach them to the angel's back. With the wings in place, I could continue adding greenery pulled from the swag. I also glued some moss around the lower rim of the pot so that I could attach some additional greenery there. Next, I found some miniature accessories in my crafting supplies that I could use to enhance the nature theme. I glued a bird's nest to the angel's head and put a rabbit in one hand and a bird and tiny birdhouse in the other. I wanted to make everything look lightly dusted with snow, so I sprayed it with adhesive and first sprinkled on some iridescent glitter and then sprinkled on a little fake snow. The last thing I had to do was decoupage the verse, "Let heaven and nature sing," to the terracotta pot. I brushed a little antiquing wax over it so it blended in better with the color of the terracotta pot. I thrifted an old wall clock and removed all of the clock parts. Then, to create a landscape scene inside the cabinet, I cut up a sheet of styrofoam. I created two hills and then painted the styrofoam with white chalk paint, and I painted the back wall with blue paint to look like sky. I wanted to add some miniature houses on the styrofoam hills, but first I wanted to add some lights. I ran a small strand of Dollar Tree fairy lights up through the pendulum hole and along one side of the styrofoam. Then I hot glued the extra wire to the ceiling of the clock box. Next, I brushed Mod Podge over the taller hill and patted on some fake snow. After that, I was ready to start adding a few of the miniature houses to the lower hill. Unfortunately, I could only fit 2 houses in the cabinet. So, after covering the lower hill with fake snow, I started filling in with small trees and other miniatures from my stash, including a small birch tree that I broke apart to create a few smaller trees. Once everything was in place, I sprayed the whole scene with adhesive and then sprinkled on iridescent glitter. Even though the cabinet is wood, it looks really flat, almost like it's been painted brown. So I added a little moss green chalk paint to a few areas just to break things up and give the clock more character. After the paint dried, I lightly distressed those spots with fine grit sandpaper and then brushed on a dark oil-based antiquing wax over both the painted areas and the stained wood to help refresh the finish and hide scratches. Since I hadn't used all of my houses, I decided to add 2 to the lower shelf. And since it was a small area, I just spread snow techs around between the houses. It's a faux snow that dries really hard. And while it was still wet, I sprinkled on a little iridescent glitter. And to finish it off, I glued an ornament of Santa's sleigh and reindeer to the top of the clock. One of my most popular and challenging projects this year was removing this huge bulletin board in my kitchen and replacing it with a Facebook Marketplace antique armoire that I got for just $50. And here it is in my kitchen. I wanted that old general store open storage look, so my first task was to remove the doors. That's why I didn't mind that one of the doors was in really bad condition. Next, I removed some newer pieces of wood that had been added to the inside of the cabinet and pulled out any loose or bent nails that I could find. Then I began adding wood glue and brad nails to repair anything that was loose or broken. Unfortunately, there were places where some of the wood had split off. So I filled those gaps with quick wood, which is a 2-part hand mixable epoxy putty that is great for repairing and rebuilding missing pieces of wood. Once it dries, it's very hard and you can sand it, drill it, and paint it. At this point, I thought the cabinet was sturdy enough to put the decorative top pieces back in place. Then I was ready to give it a good cleaning with Murphy's oil soap and warm water. And let me tell you, it was more than a little dirty. Then I began the most laborious part of the whole project, removing all the dried construction adhesive that had been applied to the inside of the cabinet. I used my heat gun to soften it up and then scraped it off with a putty knife. Since I could only remove small areas at a time, this took 4 or 5 hours to remove it all. Then I cleaned off any remaining adhesive residue using Goof Off. I made a trip to Lowe's to buy some wood for shelves and to get some brown paint color matched to the wood tone of one of the drawers. Once I got home, I sanded down the larger repairs and painted over them with the brown paint. but it definitely wasn't a perfect color match. So, to help it blend in a little better, I dabbed on some black wax and then wiped most of it back off. Considering how much damage there was, I think it did a pretty good job of disguising the repairs. I measured out where I wanted all of the shelves to go and nailed scrap strips of wood along each side of the cabinet to create supports for the shelves. Once the shelves were in place, I stained them to match as best as I could. It's nearly impossible to perfectly match old wood. The sides of the cabinet were in really poor condition, so I decided to reattach the doors to conceal them. However, the front of the doors were also in bad shape. So I needed to reverse the doors so they would completely fold back over the side of the cabinet and you would see the inside of the doors. Now, the doors won't close when they're attached this way, but no one will know that but me. And now you. Although the number one project was not one of my most popular videos, the Apothecary cabinet was definitely my best find of the year. It's partially constructed from old tobacco crates that are well over 100 years old. And I lucked out and found all the original handles in one of the drawers. But the best part is, I got it for only $50. However, it was the dirtiest piece of furniture I've ever seen, and it took me hours and bucket after bucket of hot soapy water to get clean. The cabinet had once sat on something that was now missing, so I reconstructed the old sofa table that I had replaced in the kitchen with the armoire, and it ended up being the perfect size. Before reattaching the handles to the drawers, I gave them a good cleaning and then brushed them with gold rub and buff. A few screws to attach the drawer pulls was the only thing I had to buy new for the Apothecary cabinet. If you enjoy year-end highlight videos like this, here's another one I think you might like. Thank you so much for watching today. Happy New Year!